Yep. All right. We're live. Is that our signal? Is that our
Yep.
signal? We're live. We're live. Hey, we're live. And
evening.
so tonight
How was dinner?
we're filming in front of a live studio audience. There's one person in the corner back there.
That was a little lit. We're okay. We're doing fine.
Very professional again tonight. I see.
Oh, wait.
What
Still doing
is
that again.
going on?
We're gonna work through that. We'll be right back with you. Keep going. All right, go ahead. It's me.
He hadn't figured out how to mute his phone yet. So whenever he puts the video on, we're watching ourselves over here too. So
I'm doing it for the comments.
all right. So so here we are. And tonight we want to go in a direction that I think that we want to start trying to go in every week, where we take something from the sermon and use it as a springboard to launch us into a discussion the following Wednesday night. So we talked about the virus a bunch in the beginning, and I think that we've all exhausted ourselves talking about that. And so now we're ready to move on a little bit. And so this past Sunday, we're coming to the end of Genesis. We're well into the story of Joseph now, and Joseph has been elevated to this place where he's in Egypt. He's able to save his family from a famine. And he says this statement to his brothers who sold him into slavery. He makes this interesting statement where he says, God sent me before you to save a remnant. And again, he says that it wasn't you, talking to the brothers who sold him into slavery, it wasn't you, it was God who sent me here. So thinking about that sending includes a lot of suffering, and that sending includes even some sin along the way. And so this is one of these hard things that we come up against in Scripture from time to time. And so tonight we wanted to just open that topic up a little bit more and go a little bit deeper into that. So what do we do when we have a God who doesn't work the way that we think he should? We don't. It doesn't sit well with us sometimes that he would use suffering or even sin, as I think will come up in the topic. Not that he does it or causes it, but that he allows it in his plan. And so we just wanted to open that up tonight, talk a little bit about that. And so we'll start with Joseph himself and just ask, why does that statement, God sent me before you, and all that entails, why does that cause us to raise our eyebrows? I'm asking. It's not rhetorical here, boys.
So I think that it seems like that the reason why it is so problematic is because there was so much suffering and injustice involved in it. And that's why it seems that statement that God sent me on this path, that God sent me through a hole in the ground in the desert with my brothers, to be traded among slave traders, to be sold into slavery, to be wrongly accused, to be thrown into prison, to be forgotten, all of that seems like, no, my God wouldn't work that way. Mm-hmm. Because my God is rose bushes and lilacs and daffodils. That's not the way he would be, because, that's just not the way he would be. He wouldn't do it that way. Mm-hmm. And we struggle when he does.
Yeah. That statement sit well with you?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, Jared's good with it.
Thanks so much, Jared. Again,
it's wonderful insight.
Great input from Jared over there. There you go. Thank you.
I talked too much last time. I'm giving you guys more time to talk.
Wow, he's so considerate.
I would say, I think we have, or that statement is like really hard to digest because we don't have a full grasp on what God's sovereignty is. You know what I mean? It's such a big ocean to navigate, and the infiniteness, it's just too vast, and we don't have a good comprehension as finite people to understand even how that works. Like, how can he be in control of everything? Like, why would he providentially ordain sicknesses and put them before people, and then, give a remnant for that sickness that he sent before?
Right.
And so that's so difficult. So
Yeah. To me, I think it doesn't sit well, because it means that we have to ask ourselves it raises more questions than it gives answers. It means we have to ask ourselves, how much is God in control over what happens in the world? Is he in control over viruses? Is he in control over people's evil actions and things like that? And we would say yes. We tend to say things like that God's in control, God has a plan, things like that. But to try to figure out what we mean by those statements and try to really break those down and and see what we mean by that, that leads us down this path into really a lot of speculation. But the Bible has to say a lot about that too. But I think it tends to lead us to a lot of speculation, a lot of it's just deep, and it's hard to think about that kind of stuff. And so it makes us uneasy, I think, to have to begin to ask those questions.
Yeah, I think when you, I think this is too simplistic of an answer, but I think that there's still a lot of truth about it, and that's that we see God. I mean, we want God to deal with us in the way that we want to be dealt with.
Yeah.
And so I want to be dealt with like on my couch with air conditioning or a cool breeze. I want my path to be flat and a little downhill, and the less friction as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be dealt with comfort, and he has little regard for what I want, and that's part of my problem, I think, with him. When I come up against these things and I see them, and I'm going, but this could have been so much easier. This could have been so much more comfortable, and that's just not in his spectrum of like choices. Where that's, here, let's pick out the comfortable choice today.
Yeah.
He's not. That's not at the top of his agenda, and it's at the top of my agenda. And so part of this is because I want him to be like me.
Yeah.
Which I'm glad. I bet everyone else is probably glad he's not.
Amen.
But still, yes. Amen. Is there a lot of amens coming through right now? Yeah. Everyone's glad that God is not more like me. But everyone wants God to be like them. So no one can throw too many amens at me.
Amen.
So,
yeah. I think that's true. So it started with it started with a little bit of just a question, maybe in jest, I'm not even sure. It started with a question last week before the sermon that Tim had texted to us. It just said, did God use this, or was it his plan? Speaking about Joseph. And so we started to chase that down, and it's a nuanced question, a little bit, and there's a lot of definition that needs to go into it, and I think it comes down to a lot of times this is not the way that we would have done it, so it's hard for us to imagine it being done another way, a better way, especially a way that includes suffering and includes so much pain and anguish. All along the way, we just think, well, surely there was a better way. But no, I mean, since God is working with the entire history of everything in front of him, and infinite wisdom and infinite knowledge of every cause and effect, this is the best way for it to happen. And we have to trust that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, so I don't know if that kind of answers that question. I mean, I think it raises our eyebrows also because not only is the comfort thing an issue, and I guess this is related, but we always relate to suffering as bad. I mean, that's the same thing that Job's friends did to him.
Yeah.
You're suffering today because you sinned. Confess, repent, and be healed.
Yeah.
And so we have a hard time of not feeling like that if we're suffering, if there's suffering involved, that it's a bad thing.
Like it's always a punishment.
Yeah, we think of it as a punishment, and that if we were doing right, that it would be different.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's just so much about God's sovereignty, about God's holiness, as you were saying, that there's so much about his sovereignty and holiness that reveals how finite and how small we are, because our thinking can never begin to really compare and be able to breach the glory and the breadth of God's infinite nature,
Mm-hmm.
as it's in the way that it's revealed in his sovereignty and holiness.
Yeah.
So
I have
anyway.
nothing to add.
You're being uncharacteristically quiet.
Yeah. So
Yeah, maybe.
On purpose?
No.
Come
just
on.
more like trying to figure this out.
Oh, look who just jumped in.
hi, Bob.
Bob Willits
Yeah.
is here. And I'm glad that
Now it's
he's
a party.
here. If we can take a break and just
Oh,
make sure that Bob is aware that we did not put an Eagles banner up behind us this weekend, but we did put 2 Cowboys cups on the table
but not on purpose. It's just
So-
what was on the shelf when I grabbed it when I came over with my coffee.
because God is sovereign and good.
And holy.
Yeah.
All right, good. So the next thing we talk about is so when we talk about how, what are other examples? When I started thinking about all the other examples in the Bible of that God does things in ways that makes us uncomfortable, it's astonishing how many
It's
there
a
really
long
are.
list.
It's a long list.
Yeah.
And in times when he does things, maybe that we feel like it's kind of like the comparing a round object to a square object. And we think that God should be round, but he always acts like he's a square or a triangle or an octagon. He never really does what we think he should do,
Mhm.
And so whether it's like choosing to use, Ruth instead of a good Jewish girl,
Mhm.
or choosing to use, a harlot out of Jericho instead of one of those Jewish people who have been marching around the city, being obedient all that time. No, he chose Rahab,
Yeah.
and he continues to just do those kind of things,
Yeah.
and it's confusing to us,
Yeah. Yeah. There's a long list. I was thinking, especially in terms of suffering, that was the direction that I think my thoughts went with this suffering. And in 1 Peter 4:19, Peter says, "Let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator." And so God does often work in ways that we don't expect, and when he works in ways that make us uncomfortable, the majority of those times are either, I'm going to say, maybe this will be the overstatement of the night.
Oh, that's
The
my job.
Majority of those times
That's
when
Tim.
I know, majority of those times when we're uncomfortable with the way God works is because he either uses someone that we think he shouldn't,
Amen.
Rahab or somebody like that.
Me. Yeah.
You, me.
Yeah.
Or it's because it involves suffering.
Mhm.
Because we feel like this is, there has to be a way that is easier, or doesn't cause so much pain along the way. And so, but Peter comes along then and says, "Let those who suffer according to God's will." And the truth is that it is God's will that we suffer, and he often uses suffering.
And Jesus warned us of it.
Yeah. He often includes suffering. And I think that there's a purpose to that. Suffering, suffering has a way of making us desperate, has a way of bringing us to the end of ourselves.
Getting our attention.
In a way, yeah, getting our attention. And so suffering just, it just seems to be the most effective way a lot of times of getting our attention and humbling us. Getting us to see how much we are not in control.
Exactly.
That's the thing about suffering. It takes all element of control away from us, and we get to see how very out of control we really are.
Yeah, and I'm trying not to talk about the virus, but I can't get around it. But that's exactly where we are right now, because science has become the god he's become the god of our culture. Everything is science, and if science proves it, even though it's if science proves it, then it's absolute truth. Well, now science has not been able to deal with certain things in our world, and certain things continue to come up and prove themselves to be elusive from the solutions that science could provide to it, and while it has been effective in many things, it's not effective in everything. So, and science is really the epitome of man's pride. We figured this out. We can do this. And so here we are in a situation where we can't do this. And so, and it's just interesting that it's global. It's not just a particular region or city or something like that.
Yeah. I thought about when I was trying to think of an example. I was trying to think of people who are not biblical examples. There's a ton of biblical examples of people that God uses that we think maybe shouldn't, or people who suffered in a great way. I was trying to think of who, in my mind, epitomizes suffering, not in the Bible, and I thought of Johnny Erickson Tata, who was just paralyzed at 17, became a quadriplegic, but her life, through writing books and having movies made about her and stuff, there are thousands, tens of thousands, maybe, if not more, people who have heard the gospel and believed in the gospel because of her story, because of the way that she has faithfully suffered a life now of faithfulness to the Lord, even though she's been paralyzed for 50 years now or something like that. So,
and
she started ministry
cancer as well.
Yeah.
Now she's gone through cancer.
Yeah.
I just heard her testimony again the other night. It was amazing.
Yeah. Started ministries, disability ministries, spoke at Billy Graham crusades. She's just had an amazing testimony and an amazing story. And so many people have heard the gospel because of her suffering.
Yeah.
Because she chose to use her suffering as a platform for the gospel and God's faithfulness to her in spite of the suffering. And so she was one that stood out to me as just
I think that's a great example.
I think, going back to the first question, it's disorienting having these in and then talking. It's slightly delayed. But I think one of the reasons why we may have trouble with this, especially in this narrative of Joseph, is because he may seem like the main character, but he's not the end result. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, all these things happened, and it was all about Judah. Like, really, and I think that's just a powerful, just a narrative that God does as he pleases, and it's for the better, because this happened so that Jesus could come.
Right.
And, but it's still disorienting.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking right before this started, and I was prepared to talk about the blind man in John 9, and about how here's another person who he was born blind, so he had lived a life of suffering. Being blind 2,000 years ago is probably not as easy, and not that being blind today is easy, but imagine being blind 2,000 years ago. He's born blind, and as they walk past this man, the disciples stop and ask Jesus, who sinned? That, they are operating back then, even still, on the same faulty line of reasoning that we are, that this is a punishment. Somebody sinned, either this man or his parents. Who sinned that he would be born blind? And Jesus says, he was born blind so that today my power can be displayed through him. In other words, his whole life of blindness has kind of led up to this one moment where I'm going to now reveal a little bit of who I am through this man, to the glory of the Father, and do a miracle. And then, people are gonna rejoice. Like, this is gonna be this is a big moment, and this guy's life has kind of led him here through a lot of suffering. But his point is, his blindness is not a result of sin. His blindness is just something that God did to him to get him to this moment where Jesus would free this man. So, again, suffering, disability, even you had mentioned one.
Yeah.
Earlier, leprosy.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about your example there, and so then is the same thing true for the woman who had the issue of blood for 12 years, or the demoniac, or all those people that he healed? Did they suffer those issues for Christ to step in and heal them? But an even more problematic question is what about those who were never healed? When you think about like God's purpose and people serving a purpose in the context of, if you say you're going to start in Genesis 3 and you're going to watch God unfold his plan up until, the resurrection, then what was the purpose for Hebrews to suffer and die for 400 years in slavery? What was their purpose? Yeah. And those are really hard questions because we see things as needing to even out. We see things as needing to be fair at our level, and God doesn't feel the need to be fair at our level. Thank goodness he doesn't, and Betty Jo, she often brings up the passage out of Leviticus 14 where God says that he places leprosy in that home. He says, when you move into the land and when I place leprosy in that home, he takes the blame for it. He says, I'm the one who put that there. Mm-hmm. And so, Betty talks about that verse a lot because she's like going, that's just amazing, and it is. So, But yeah, I hadn't thought about this until you brought up before we get started, and that's that I was thinking about suffering, and I was thinking about people that God used, like that it didn't make sense why God would use those people, whether it was Samson, or all kinds of different other examples of people that were like going, that person, there was someone better that God could have used, than doing it that way. But the book of Judges is all about the least likely person is the person God uses. And it really should be the model and the mold for what we expect of God for all of eternity.
Yeah.
Judges should be that book we look to and go, oh, that's the way he is. He'll pick the least likely, he'll pick the one that no one else picked, and then he will give him the abilities, and then he will boil that person down to being a blind slave in a Philistine court, or to being a man with only 400 warriors to go with him against innumerable odds. So it's not enough that he picks the last one anyone would pick. He wants to make it even smaller, the smallest denomination, the smallest little bit of any hope, any glimmer of hope, he wants to remove that from the equation so that when things happen, it's gone, oh, God did that.
Yep.
God did that.
Yep.
And
he does that all the time. Like the history of Israel was like, oh well, the younger will serve the older. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
All the time. And then that was
That's
always
so true.
flipped.
That's right. That's right.
That's flipped all the time.
Right.
Are these all the brothers? Yeah, that's all of them. Well, except for the one out in the field.
Yeah.
Can't be
what
that
I
one.
want.
And that's exactly what happened with Joseph in the same sense, and that's what happened with Jacob and Esau.
Right.
And that's what happens all the time.
Right.
Every single time. And when I think about these things, and especially the sovereignty of God, I always go to John 9 with the healing of the blind man.
Mm-hmm. David was talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I started to say, he just said that, right?
yeah.
Okay, I'm just fine. Good. We're good. Keep going.
It's just that answers pretty much all of my questions. Why does this happen? Because the Lord.
But the thing is, the problem with that is that that's really easy for us to read it. But, I can imagine that, like 4 years ago at Thanksgiving when Scott Brew got a diagnosis of cancer, well, was that satisfactory to him in that moment? And is that satisfactory to, to many people who are find themselves in situations now that they didn't expect or want. Is it and so while that is a true answer, that's not an answer that we as people come to immediately most of the time.
Well, that's not an answer you can give. Like, I would never go up to somebody while they're suffering and be like,
Well,
deal with it. Like, that's not.
It works for me all the time.
Yeah, no, but it's not a practical pastoral thing. You know what I mean? I think that may be a different question in like, how do you deal with that gracefully? And the only way to do that is through relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the only possible way.
Mm-hmm.
And this may be an overstatement. I'm gonna say it. And we're doing the
You're
overstatement.
taking
let's
my job
do it.
away
Let's
from
do
me.
it.
I think Christians who do that should be ashamed of themselves. Like, that's not helpful in the moment. When someone is suffering and hurting, our job is not to tell them, well, then just believe in God. Just do it. Like that. You're right. It's not a satisfactory answer.
Yeah.
The sovereignty of God, like we talked about earlier, is so big and so vast, and something that almost needs to be experienced in a person's life through suffering.
But the thing is though is that people are always. I mean, I listened to Greg Kuchel from Stand to Reason, and he said the most difficult question to answer is the conflict, quote unquote, between about God and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And is he and why does he allow that to happen? And so it is an incredibly difficult thing about God that he has about himself, and he continues to use it. He's not shy about it. And so we're left in this position to have to try and to explain it to people or point people to Scripture somehow or another to help people understand that. And it is a really difficult place to be when someone is really upset about it too,
Yeah, that answer, although theologically correct, that God is sovereign and that he's somehow wills everything that happens, that's not pastorally helpful when somebody's in your office crying and hurting.
Yeah.
That tends to come off a little cold and a little bit unhelpful.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of what Job's friends did.
Oh, yeah.
When his friends, when they first showed up, they sat with him, and it says, that was great while they were just sitting with him while he lamented. And then they opened their mouth, and it was just all downhill from there. So, sometimes the best thing to do is not give a well-packaged theological answer. It's to just sit with people when they're suffering. When they're asking why, most of the time, maybe all the time, the best thing is not to try to answer why, but just sit with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. Pastoral Care by Steve Adler.
Yes.
But we're not here to talk about pastoral care. We're here to talk about why and how God uses what he does. And so now Jared's going to answer how God sovereignly ordains that everything that happens comes to pass. Go for it.
What? What? Why? Well, that's so big.
Well, come on. We've got, half hour left. You can do it.
Right.
What did you ask him?
Cool.
I was just kidding. It wasn't even one of our questions.
Oh, I started saying, I don't see that on the paper.
Tim's looking over.
Wow. I'm kind of going, I'm kind of panicking. I was starting to sweat a bit there.
He was like, I didn't prepare for this question.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. I don't know where we went now.
Yeah, we took it off. But so let's talk about conclusions we draw from what we see about God in Scripture. So when we see him use Rahab, a harlot, a pagan harlot when you think about it, Rahab is another Joseph, in the sense that she provided salvation to God's people. I mean, she was the one, the spies came in, she gave shelter to them. She was another, and so here God uses Joseph, a righteous man, and treats him and puts him through all kinds of suffering. Then he takes an unrighteous woman and rewards her for helping the people. And so it's kind of like, what kind of conclusions do we draw? Or what do we have to, what do we come to decide about God when he continues over and over and over again to do the things we don't think he should do?
Yeah.
Why didn't he just leave Samson out in the wilderness? Just let him go. Why, all kinds of stuff like that. Why did he choose to use those people and do things those ways,
Yeah.
And the ultimate one, I'm sorry if I'm going to get ahead on you though, but the ultimate example of that is the cross. I mean, surely there was another way. That's what we would think.
Yeah.
Surely there was another way, but that seemed so horrible. And it was so horrible, and there is nothing you can find that is good about that except for what it accomplished.
Yeah. Yeah, and even there, that is the example that stands alone in my mind as how does God sovereignly ordain something to come to pass that involves so much suffering and so much sin? Because there's a lot of sin that has to go into that.
Mm-hmm.
Judas's betrayal, Pilate, Herod, the crowds wanting him crucified. There's a lot of sin that all go into the cross. And yet that's the plan. That's the plan from the beginning. The lamb slain before the foundation of the world. That was the plan all along. But that plan is only going to happen through all of these sinful acts of people. So that's one that just, I have no answer.
Yeah.
And we're not trying to answer it, but just trying to say, like, how do we approach this God who works and is so big and so powerful and so wise and so impossible for us to understand?
Yeah.
His ways.
Greg Koukl has an illustration he uses, and he says, imagine soldiers lying on a battlefield wounded, and one of the soldiers there that's wounded is a medic, and he says he sees an enemy soldier with his bayonet on his gun going around finishing off wounded people. And as he walks up to his friend, the medic says the medic knows that the guy lying next to him is bleeding out of his leg and he's going to lose his leg, and the only way to save his life is to take off his leg. And the medic says to the enemy soldier, torture him, just torture him, cut off his leg and leave him to die. And the enemy soldier does that. And Koukl says that it seems it was the enemy soldier didn't do anything to help the guy in his mind. His intent was to torture, but the medic used his evil intent to save that man's life. And he goes, that's the closest illustration we have to try to explain how God uses the evil intent of mankind to accomplish his purposes.
Yeah.
And even that illustration, I'm sure, breaks down, but still,
yeah,
it's not something we can wrap our head around very easily and say, oh, I totally understand that. Let me explain it to you,
No. Yeah, but the scriptures don't, they don't necessarily attempt to explain it.
That's so true.
They just put it out there. The Lord just puts it out there in his word as kind of it is what it is. Acts 2 and again in Acts 4, talking about the cross, we see that Herod and Pilate and the crowds and the, Judas and everyone, they all conspired together to do what the Lord's plan and to do what the Lord had predestined to take place.
Yes.
And then we just move on with the story in Acts and kind of like, what? So we accept that somehow God is in his sovereignty, that he is big enough to ordain or will that these things happen. and yet those people be still held responsible for their moral actions. They still be held responsible for their sin. God is not responsible for their sin, but they sinned, and he used that sin and had somehow ordained that happen to get us to the cross,
Yeah.
which is the ultimate good in the entire universe.
Right.
And so, yeah, total head scratcher on that one. I got nothing.
Head scratcher. Yeah, exactly.
I got
Yeah.
nothing beyond that. But yeah, Joseph and his brothers, same thing. There's a lot of evil that goes into that. And there's stories like that, throughout the Bible that you just go, look at all the bad stuff that happened here. And then when you think about, Pharaoh is another one, the Exodus. God goes to Moses and says, go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. But I'm going to harden his heart so that he won't. And so Moses goes and says, let my people go, plague. Let my people go, plague. Let my people go, plague. God is there hardening his heart the whole time so that he won't let the people go. But
and that's where they would say that God used the evil intent of his heart to accomplish his purpose.
Yeah, and it was so that...
And that would be even true as well as when he talks about how God used Assyria to punish the nation. These guys hate you anyway, so I'm going to let them punish you.
Yeah.
That's probably an understatement. So, but still.
Yeah, but without that, you've got no Passover. You've got no Exodus from Egypt. And so there's so many examples like that as you just go through the Word, you begin to see them for what they are. They're these crazy events where God is working through so much bad and so much suffering but he is good the whole time.
See,
and he's bringing us to a good purpose at the end of it.
And that's the problem. I mean, that's not the problem, but that is a problem, or that's this thing that so when we talk about what conclusions do we have to draw from these stories and everything, in these stories, God is still good.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And in these stories, he is still in control. And as he still uses the sinfulness of man, he is still holy. And so all those things, it's kind of like we go back to what we know is truth. And then we go, if that is true, then these other things have to fit into that. And that's where we run into a problem, I think, in this particular issue, is that we have a hard time reconciling the ugliness of sin and man's sin with God's holiness and his goodness. And God doesn't have a problem with that. And that's where I've said it to church before. It's like that there is a tension between two opposing truths that I feel like I'm okay with a lot of times. This one is more difficult. But God is totally good, and yet these things happen. And there's a tension between whether both of those things can be true. And I think that God lives in that tension, and he's totally comfortable there, and we're not,
Yeah.
Well, I think we're not comfortable with it because how can these horrible things happen and then, the problem pain? Like, how can these horrible things happen and God be good and all-powerful?
But I mean, no, I think that's the issue. I mean, God doesn't have a problem with that.
Right.
Only we do.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I said
Well,
that
it's a
too.
problem for us because
Right.
it's a problem for us because we feel like we need an explanation. We have to be able to explain everything. Like, it's uncomfortable for me because these two things don't line up, and I need them to line up, or else I'm not okay with it.
Right.
And that is not the way that God operates.
Right. I mean, it's what I said on Sunday on the sermon. It's kind of like, is God only good when it benefits me?
Mm-hmm.
Or is he only good when I can see him doing it,
Mm-hmm.
And the fact of the matter is that's the nature of faith, and that's what he says, like, that is the highway to God is faith, and as Chris Gregory says in here, she's talking about that trusting in the character of God. And it's like, if this is who God is, and he's always proven himself true, then all these things have to be within his character as well. They do not violate his character, and those are hard for us to figure out, but they're still true, and I guess that's the thing, is that perhaps I hadn't thought about this. I think I can say this without losing my job. I think, is it possible that God's truth always has to be understandable. Is it true? Can I say that?
Yeah,
What do you
can
mean?
say that.
I can say that?
I mean, that's the point of parables. Like Jesus spoke in parables to he
Yeah.
says it. He was
Yeah.
like, I speak in parables so you don't understand.
Yeah.
I don't want you to understand.
Yeah.
And we're like, what? Like, he says that straight up to all of his disciples. And that's a really hard thing. Like, we're not meant to understand the full
Yeah, okay.
reality.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Because that goes back to a thought I had a moment ago, and that's that, like, God's character, God is not completely knowable.
No.
His character is sure, and his character is absolutely knowable. We can know that he is all these things, but the outworking of that character totally knocks us on our rear all the time,
Yeah.
because we think that a good God will only do good, happy, fluffy things, and a good God often does really hard things,
Yeah.
and so, yeah.
I think one of the things that's really hard in the tension too is, and I was talking to you guys about it when we were planning this, is like God's character is immutable. Like it doesn't change.
Immutable means that you cannot mute him.
Right. You can't. He's unchangeable.
very
He's
loud.
the same
Unchangeable.
yesterday, today.
He's always
Very
very,
loud,
loud.
like your Amplified
yes,
Bible.
Yes, that's
Um,
right. So immutable means he does not change.
He does not change.
Right.
And so when we talk about his character, he's not good because he gives us good things. He's good because he is. He's not faithful because he's faithful to bless us. He's faithful because that's who he is.
He is.
And
That is the I am.
right. And
Yeah.
the outworking of that, there are secondary things that happen because of that character, which are blessings and good things. But the moment that we start, and I think this is where, we have a trouble with sovereignty as Americans. I can only speak it as American. That we want stuff, and we want stuff when we want it, and we want to be taken care of how we want to be taken care of. And when things don't go our way, we start to moan and cry and complain. And so when we are being dealt with, or a blessing that we think should happen to us doesn't happen when we want it, we're like, oh, well then, I'm so mad at this God. Like, why would he let this happen? Why doesn't this happen when I want it to?
Well, but that goes all the way back to Exodus, and man is not good enough for me.
Right.
That's man's nature, So, yeah.
Probably even further back than that,
Probably further back
to the garden,
to the garden.
maybe. But I want that one.
Yeah.
I
Exactly.
can't have
I
this
want
one,
that one.
but that's the one that I want.
No, I want that
and,
one.
And can I make a distinction real
Yes,
quick?
please do.
Like, we talk about this, so all of us here at this table and all of us listening, we could not do better. Like, all that stuff happened because sinful people. And if we were in those situations now, we would do the same exact thing.
I know.
You know why? Because we do it every day.
Exactly.
Every day. Every day. I complain about doing the dishes. And, like small little, contrite things. Like all the things. Like Israel in the Old Testament and the early church in the New Testament, that's a mirror of who we are.
It is. And people always go, well, if I were to see Jesus, I would absolutely know when I saw him. Well, you should be.
I would never betray him.
Yeah, I
yeah,
know,
you
I know.
would.
Thank you, Peter.
do all the
Sit
time.
down, Peter. Outside in the courtyard. Cock's about to crow 3 times.
Yeah. One of my outcomes that I put down here, I said sometimes it's just best to simply rest in Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord. I think that this, way back earlier in the comments, I saw somebody saying, who are we to kind of pry into the mind of God? And I think that, we have a lot. He's given us quite a bit that we can know about him. And so I think it's worthwhile, and I think that it's good to study, and I think it is good to try to reconcile some of these things that are very difficult. But at the end of the day, when we can't, we we just kind of go, you know what, this is what the word says. And if I believe that the word is true, then I believe that God is absolutely sovereign and that I am also morally free in the sense that I am held responsible for my actions.
Right.
And so God
And that's
will
another thing
use
that people don't
those.
like.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he will work, congruently, his will, kind of, I have these evil intentions, but he has good intentions, and those things work together. Sometimes they include sin or suffering or whatever. And I can't figure out how those things go together, but that's not something that's been revealed, and
Right.
that's okay.
Right.
That's one of those secret things that as a finite being, I just can't, it's not for me to know that, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So that's one of those secret things.
You've kind of gone to like, what do we do with a God like this? That's what you had. That was your last question for us, or what should we not do? Maybe also, and the verse that I think probably someone maybe mentioned, I don't know, but the verse that is always comes up in these discussions is Isaiah 55 about my thoughts are not your thoughts and your ways are not my ways.
Yeah.
And that giant gap between between us and Him, and that just speaks to the fact that like we have to accept Him for who He is, and understanding that we will never be able to fathom the grandeur of the Creator who could create this in the first place. But then not only that, but would also have a plan from the moment of the sin in the garden, would have a plan going forward to solve that sin. And not only that, but that the solution to it would be His own Son.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, when we stop and have a sane moment, we should look at that and go, never mind. We should pull a Job. Who am I?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's what Job did. When God got through saying, where were you when I did this? And where were you did this? And do you know where I keep the hail? And do you know where I keep the snow? Do you know that? Talk to me if you know so much. I mean, Job sits there and goes, I talk of things I know nothing about.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like when we consider all this and we say, God owes me an explanation for why He can use evil. It's kind of like, no, He doesn't. We should just sit still and be quiet.
You missed the best part of that. He says, gird your loins.
I know. I love gird your loins.
Answer me.
I love gird your loins. That's my favorite saying. Gird your loins.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think couple things I think that we do. It's funny, somebody already alluded to one of my things I said we should not do. A couple things I said we should do. We should worship. We should be humbled. We should, it should inspire awe in us to worship a God who is able to command the universe the way that He does, and to incorporate all of these different things and use them the way He does. One thing I said we should not do, that I think you said it a while ago, Jared, is pretend that we could make the universe in a better way. We should just not pretend that like we know better, or that I would have done any differently than what's been done.
Well, you know what though? What's fun? I'm not being a fan of this particular actor, but this particular movie is a great example of that, and that's like the Jim Carrey movie. The one where he becomes
Bruce Almighty.
Bruce Almighty.
Bruce Almighty.
I don't ever want to refer to Jim Carrey in a positive light necessarily, but Bruce Almighty was a great example of that. I can know how to do this better.
Yeah.
And it was really a very humorous, colorful illustration of like, no, we don't.
Yeah.
And all. But to your point a moment ago, I think it's really true. It's that like it should leave us where we are put in the same place as Job was. Sit down and be quiet. I don't know what I'm talking about. And then you used the word awe. And I think that is great. I think that's the right word. And it made me spring to thinking about that what is the beginning of wisdom? It's the fear of the Lord. And it's not being afraid of Him. It's being in awe of Him. Mm-hmm. And so these kind of questions, while there are, really in some ways unanswerable, they're the kind of questions that should put us in that place where we begin to grasp what Proverbs 3 says. That the beginning of wisdom is to be in awe of our God, and to realize that He has a plan, and that He is sovereign, and that He is holy, and that all of these characteristics of Him, all of this nature of His, will not be undone or violated, and so we can always have a certainty in that.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Selah.
Selah.
You're not Selahing, you're laughing.
Selah. That's where the guitar solo comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or just the pads, a little hum. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah. So all was a word I came up with because I think that's a great word. I think
It is.
For
It's overused, unfortunately, but it's true. It's a great word.
It is. When you when you consider who God is, and so just to think about the one subject that we've thought about tonight, how He uses sin or suffering, and how in His providence